So last time, we talked about domain and range, and then positive, negative, and 0. We're going to continue that list today by talking about decreasing and constant. So that's the topic for today. Again, when we describe increasing, decreasing, and constant, we're talking about where the graph is increasing, where the graph is decreasing, where the graph is constant. So when we answer these where questions about a graph, we're going to answer it using x coordinates. So we're going to say, oh, it's increasing when x is 3 all the way up to 10, or something like that. Everybody okay with that idea? What do we mean by increasing? We're talking about when the graph is going uphill as you're walking along the graph from left to right. Decreasing, we're talking about downhill. And constant is basically when there is no incline. So let's take a look at a picture. So when we're talking about increasing, decreasing, and constant, what you have to remember is that we're always reading our graph from left to right, just like you would read a book or read a sheet of paper. So when we talk about uphill, we're talking about as you walk along the graph. Pretend you have a little man that walks along the graph that starts on the left-hand side and ends on the right-hand side of the graph. I like to give my little man a name. I call him Hans, like he's a Swiss mountain climber or something. So as Hans walks along the graph, when he walks along this segment of the graph, he's going uphill. Everybody agree with that? When he walks along this segment of the graph, it's flat. And when he walks along this segment of the graph, it's downhill. Everybody okay with that idea? Visually, we kind of get what I mean by increasing, decreasing, and constant. So again, the key is remembering you're looking at the graph as you're moving from the left to the right. So just like you're reading a book, your little mountain climber, your little man, walks along the graph, starting on the left side and going to the right side. If you prefer a woman, you can draw a woman. Or an ambiguous gendered person, that's fine too. Or an animal. Whatever you want to think of walking along the graph, you can have walk along your graph. So, in this case, my increasing section, the leftmost point on that increasing section includes the left-hand arrow, so that's going to be negative infinity. And I stop walking uphill when I get to negative 2. Everybody agree with that? Okay. The negative infinity is always going to get a parenthesis. Now the question becomes, where do I put the negative 2? Does the negative 2, is that part of the increasing part, or is it part of the constant part? It's actually part of neither. So any of these transition points, like this, we're not going to count in any of the sections. So we're just going to omit those from any of the sections. So the constant section begins at -2 and then ends at +3. And again, we're not going to include those transition points. When I say transition point, I mean where the graph changes from increasing to decreasing, or increasing to constant, or constant to decreasing. Any point where the graph changes between those three, we're not going to include in any of the three sets. And then my decreasing begins at +3, and then it includes the right-hand arrow, so that's infinities. And in general, these increasing, decreasing, constant sets will always just be parentheses at either end. You don't really have to worry about the brackets here by the way that we're going to define these things. Okay with that idea? So that's nice, at least, right? You don't have to worry about bracket or parentheses on these like you do for the positives and negatives and zeros. Let's do another example, yes? So I included some distractor points in here because we're actually going to do two things on this problem. We're going to do both increasing and decreasing and positive, negative. Grace? Yeah, of course. You can go right now if you need to. Yeah, no worries. Okay. Let's do the increasing, decreasing, constant part first, though. So, increasing parts. How many increasing parts do you guys see? Yeah, I see just one as well. It's this section right here. So that section begins at -2 and goes to +3. Everybody agree with that? Okay. How about decreasing? How many decreasing parts do you guys see? I see 2 as well. So I see 1 here, and then 1 here. So I'm going to need to use 2 intervals to describe each, or for those 2 parts. The first interval begins at -6 and ends at -4. The second interval begins at +3 and then ends with the right-hand arrow, so that's positive infinity. And then lastly, we need to do constants. I see 1 constant part. That begins at -4 and ends at -2. Everybody on board with that? Okay. Let's do positive, negative, 0 next. We're going to do that for the same graph. Okay. How many positive sections do we see? 2. I agree. So there's this one on the far right, and this one kind of in the middle. How many negative sections do we see? 2. I have this part here, and then the far right end of the graph here. And then how many zeros do we see? 3. One here, one here, and one here. Everybody okay with that? Okay. So the positive part begins at -6 and then ends at -5. I notice the point with the x-coordinate of -6 is above the x-axis, so that part's going to get a bracket. But the part with the -5 is on the x-axis, so that'll get a parenthesis. And then I need my union. I didn't leave myself enough space there. The next section begins at -1 and ends at +6. I notice that each of those, -1, 0, and +6, 0, both lie on the x-axis, so those are going to get parentheses. Those aren't positive points. My decreasing, the first section begins at -5 and ends at -1. Again, both of those points, -5, 0, -1, 0, are on the x-axis, so those don't count as decreasing points. And then my second section begins at +6 and includes the right-hand arrow, so that goes to positive infinity. The infinities always get a parenthesis. And then 6, 0 is on the x-axis, so it doesn't count as a decreasing point. And then we notice we have just 3 zeros, so I can describe my zeros using a finite set. And just list the 3 zeros in question. Okay. Everybody feel comfortable about the difference between increasing, decreasing, constant, positive, negative, 0, Andrew? Oh, yes, thank you. Yeah, I erased the negative because I wrote my positive intervals too big, and then I rewrote the wrong word. Yes, thank you. That should be negative.